The letter arrived on a Tuesday, slipped under the door of Julian Carter's cramped Mission District apartment, its wax seal glinting like a warning. By nightfall, he'd read it a dozen times, each word slicing deeper. Return to Havenwood. The ceremony is Saturday. Come alone. His fingers trembled as he traced the embossed crest of the Whitaker family, a name that had haunted him for years. Julian, 28, a black graphic designer with a quiet intensity, hadn't set foot in Havenwood, Oregon, since he'd left at 18, fleeing a town that never understood him. The letter wasn't an invitation. It was a summons, tied to the death of his estranged uncle, Roland Whitaker, a reclusive tech mogul whose fortune was the stuff of legend. Julian's boyfriend, Mateo Alvarez, 29, a Latino community organizer with a laugh that could light up a room, found him staring at the letter on the couch. "You're not actually going, are you?" Mateo asked, his voice soft but edged with worry. "I have to," Julian said, his jaw tight. "If I don't, I'll always wonder why they called me back." Havenwood was a postcard-perfect coastal town, all cedar-shingled houses and fog-draped cliffs. But to Julian, it was a cage. Growing up as the only black kid in a wealthy white family, adopted by his mother's sister, Roland's sister, after his parents died, had been a masterclass in feeling like an outsider. The Whitakers were old money, their name etched into the town's library, hospital, and yacht club. Roland, the patriarch, had been the worst of them. Cold, controlling, and viciously traditional. When Julian came out at 16, Roland had called it a phase and banned him from family gatherings unless he fixed himself. Julian chose freedom instead, cutting ties and building a life in San Francisco with Mateo, where love didn't come with conditions. Now Roland was dead and the ceremony, a memorial annual reading, was pulling Julian back. Mateo insisted on coming, despite the letter's warning. "I'm not letting you face those vultures alone," he said, his dark eyes fierce. Julian wanted to argue but couldn't. Mateo's stubborn loyalty was why he loved him. They packed a single suitcase, drove up the coast in their beat-up hatchback, and checked into a creaky B&B on Havenwood's outskirts. The town hadn't changed. Same quaint streets, same judgmental stares. Julian felt 16 again, small and exposed. The Whitaker estate loomed on a hill, a Gothic sprawl of stone and stained glass. Saturday morning, Julian adjusted his tie in the B&B's foggy mirror, his stomach churning. Mateo, in a cream sweater that made his tan skin glow, squeezed his hand. "You're enough, Jules. Always have been." Julian nodded, but doubt gnawed at him. What did Roland want with him now? Why the secrecy? At the estate, the air was thick with tension. The Whitaker clan, cousins, aunts, and uncles Julian barely remembered, filled the grand hall, their designer clothes and fake tears clashing with the room's somber mahogany. Julian's aunt, Evelyn, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, intercepted him at the door. "You came," she said, her voice like ice. Her gaze flicked to Mateo, who stood a step behind. "I told you to come alone." "He's my partner," Julian said, his voice steady despite the heat rising in his chest. Evelyn's lips thinned. "This is a family matter. He waits outside." Mateo bristled, but Julian touched his arm. "It's okay," he whispered. "I'll be fine." Mateo's jaw clenched, but he nodded and stepped back, his absence leaving Julian hollow. Inside, the ceremony began with a minister's droning eulogy for Roland, painting him as a saint. Julian's cousins, Blake and Cassandra, both in their 30s and dripping with entitlement, whispered about stock portfolios and summer homes. Julian sat rigid, feeling their eyes on him, the charity case who dared return. The will reading was held in a private study, its walls lined with leather-bound books. The family lawyer, Mr. Hargrove, a wiry man with a nasal voice, unsealed Roland's will with theatrical precision. Julian expected nothing, maybe a token heirloom at best. Roland had never cared for him, but as Hargrove read, the room went still. To Julian Carter, my nephew, Hargrove intoned, I bequeath my entire estate, properties, investments, and liquid assets, totaling $1.2 billion, as sole heir, provided he fulfills one condition. The air sucked out of the room. Blake's glass shattered on the floor. Cassandra gasped, her manicured nails digging into her chair. Evelyn's face turned ashen. Julian's heart pounded so loud he barely heard the condition. Reside in Havenwood for 1 year, overseeing the Whitaker Foundation. Why him? Blake spat, his face red. He's not even real family. Enough! Hargrove snapped, but the room erupted. Cousins shouted. Evelyn demanded a recount, and Julian sat frozen, the weight of $1.2 billion sinking in. He wasn't just inheriting money, he was inheriting power and the family's resentment. Outside, Matteo waited on the estate steps, his breath visible in the chilly air. When Julian emerged, pale and dazed, Matteo grabbed his hands. What happened? They want me to stay, Julian said, his voice barely above a whisper. And they're going to hate me for it. The drive back to the B&B was silent, the weight of the will pressing against Julian's chest like a stone. Matteo kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting on Julian's knee, a quiet anchor. Talk to me, Matteo said finally, pulling into the gravel lot. What's going on in that head of yours? Julian stared out at the fog rolling off the Pacific. I don't know why he chose me, he said. Roland hated me. He hated who I am. The memory of Roland's sneer when Julian came out still burned. You're a disgrace to this family. Why would a man like that leave him everything? Matteo turned off the engine, his eyes searching Julian's. Maybe he saw something in you he couldn't admit. Or maybe this is his way of making amends. Amends? Julian scoffed. He made me hide you today. Same old Roland. Matteo's face softened. He's gone, Jules. This is about you now. What do you want? That question haunted Julian as they climbed the B&B's creaky stairs. He didn't want Havenwood, with its suffocating memories and small-town bigotry. But $1.2 billion could change everything, not just for him and Matteo, but for the causes they cared about. Matteo ran a nonprofit for queer youth in San Francisco. Julian designed pro bono for community centers. With that money, they could build something real, something lasting. But the cost, living in Havenwood for a year, under the Whitaker family's glare, was steep. The next morning, Julian met Hargrove at a diner on Main Street, its neon sign flickering in the drizzle. The lawyer slid a thick folder across the table. The Whitaker Foundation funds local charities, Hargrove explained. Hospitals, schools, arts programs. Roland was its figurehead, but he left the real work to advisors. Now that's you. Julian flipped through the folder, his artist's eye-catching on pie charts and grant proposals. The foundation was a machine, funneling millions into Havenwood's polished facade. But there were gaps, shelters, mental health services, anything for marginalized groups barely funded. Roland didn't care about people like me, Julian said, closing the folder. Why should I care about his legacy? Hargrove leaned forward, his glasses glinting. Because it's not his anymore. It's yours. Back at the B&B, Julian found Matteo on the porch, sketching the coastline in a worn notebook. Matteo's dream was to open a community center for queer kids, a safe haven he'd never had growing up in Oakland. Julian sat beside him, the folder heavy in his hands. "If I do this," he said, "we could fund your center. Not just one, dozens." Mateo's pencil stilled. "But you'd have to stay here. We'd have to stay." Julian nodded, the reality sinking in. Havenwood wasn't just a place. It was a battlefield. The Whitakers would fight him every step, and the town's old guard wouldn't take kindly to a black, gay man wielding power. But Mateo's hand found his warm and steady. "If you're in, I'm in," Mateo said. They decided to stay, renting a small cottage on the edge of town. The first weeks were a gauntlet. Blake and Cassandra filed lawsuits, claiming the will was coerced. Evelyn spread rumors at the country club, calling Julian a gold digger. Locals whispered when he and Mateo walked hand in hand to the grocery store. But Julian threw himself into the foundation, redirecting funds to underserved communities. He approved grants for a women's shelter and a youth mentorship program, each decision a small rebellion against Roland's legacy. Mateo, meanwhile, charmed the town's skeptics. He volunteered at the library, coached kids' soccer, and won over the diner's grumpy owner with his mom's tamale recipe. Slowly, a few locals warmed to them, a librarian named Sarah, a trans teen named Riley who idolized Mateo. But the Whitakers' resentment simmered, and Julian felt it every time he stepped into the foundation's office, their glares like knives. One night, a brick crashed through the cottage's window, wrapped in a note, "Leave or else." Julian's hands shook as he swept up the glass, but Mateo pulled him close. "They're scared," Mateo said. "You're changing things, and they can't stand it." Julian wanted to believe him, but fear gnawed at him. What if this was a mistake? What if Havenwood broke them? The brick was just the beginning. Over the next month, the threats escalated. Slashed tires, anonymous calls, a spray-painted slur on their mailbox. Julian reported each incident to the police, but the sheriff, a Whitaker family friend, shrugged them off as pranks. Mateo, ever the optimist, kept Julian grounded, but even he looked worn, his usual spark dimmed by sleepless nights. At the foundation, Julian's reforms stirred a hornet's nest. He pushed for a grant to fund Havenwood's first LGBTQ+ support group, led by Riley, the trans teen who'd become their shadow. The board, stacked with Roland's old allies, balked. "This isn't what the foundation is for." One member, a retired banker named Harold, sneered. Julian held his ground, citing budget surpluses. The grant passed, but Harold's parting glare promised retaliation. Julian's only ally on the board was Sarah, the librarian, who'd grown up in Havenwood and knew its underbelly. "They're not used to someone like you," she told him over coffee. "You're not just an outsider, you're rewriting their rules." Sarah was in her 40s, white, with a sharp wit and a rainbow pin on her jacket. She'd lost friends when she came out as bisexual, and her quiet courage inspired Julian. One evening, Julian and Mateo hosted Riley at the cottage. The 17-year-old, with their dyed blue hair and nervous energy, talked about the support group's first meeting. 10 kids showed up, Riley said, their eyes bright. "They're scared, but they came." Julian felt a swell of pride, but it was cut short by a knock at the door. It was Evelyn, her face a mask of forced civility. "We need to talk," she said, stepping inside without invitation. Her eyes flicked to Mateo, then Riley, her disdain barely concealed. "You're making a mess of Roland's legacy," she said to Julian. "Step down, or we'll make life harder for you." Julian's pulse raced. "Harder than bricks through my window?" Evelyn didn't flinch. "You don't belong here," You never did. Mateo stepped forward, his voice low but firm. He's more family than you'll ever be. Evelyn left without another word, but her threat lingered. That night, Julian couldn't sleep, his mind replaying every slight, every stare. Mateo, sensing his unrest, pulled him close. We're stronger than them, he whispered. Together. The next day, Julian found an old journal in the Foundation's archives, tucked behind dusty ledgers. It was Roland's, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting. Most entries were cold, businesslike, but one, dated a year before his death, stopped Julian cold. I was wrong about the boy. He's stronger than us all. The words shook him. Was this about him? Had Roland seen something in him, after all? Julian shared the journal with Mateo, who read it under the cottage's lamplight. He knew you were different, Mateo said. Maybe he envied you. Or maybe he's still controlling me, Julian replied, his voice heavy. The journal raised more questions than answers, but it fueled Julian's resolve. He doubled down on the Foundation, funneling funds to mental health programs and affordable housing. The town began to split. Some, like Sarah and Riley, rallied behind him. Others, led by the Whitakers, dug in their heels. At a town hall meeting, Blake confronted Julian publicly, accusing him of stealing the family's legacy. The crowd murmured, some nodding, others shifting uncomfortably. Julian stood, his voice steady. This foundation isn't about your family, he said. It's about this town, and I'm not going anywhere. The room erupted. Some clapped, others jeered. Mateo, in the back, grinned, his pride a beacon in the chaos. But as they left, a stranger bumped into Julian, slipping a note into his pocket. You're not safe here. The note burned a hole in Julian's pocket for days. He didn't tell Mateo, not wanting to add to his worry, but the words looped in his mind. You're not safe. Havenwood's charm had peeled away, revealing a town divided by fear and loyalty. Julian felt the weight of every decision, every grant, every step he took as a black, gay man in a place that wanted him gone. He threw himself into work, meeting with community leaders and expanding the Foundation's reach. Riley's support group grew, drawing queer kids from neighboring towns. Sarah helped Julian draft a proposal for a community center, a hub for art and advocacy. But the threats didn't stop. Another slashed tire, a dead bird left on their porch. Julian installed security cameras, but the police remained useless, their loyalties clear. One afternoon, while sorting Foundation files, Julian found a hidden folder labeled RW Personal. Inside were letters, dozens of them, addressed to a man named Thomas. They were love letters, written in Roland's hand, spanning decades. I can't be what you need, one read. This town would destroy us. Julian's breath caught. Roland had been closeted, his life a lie. The journal's words, he's stronger than us all, made sense now. Roland hadn't just seen Julian. He'd envied his courage to live openly. Julian showed the letters to Mateo, who read them in stunned silence. He hid who he was, Mateo said, his voice thick, and he left you everything to make it right. Maybe, Julian said, but guilt gnawed at him. Roland's pain didn't erase the hurt he'd caused. Still, the letters humanized him, and Julian felt a strange responsibility to honor that truth. The Whitaker family's attacks intensified. Cassandra leaked a story to the local paper, painting Julian as a greedy outsider. Blake cornered him at the Foundation office, his face inches from Julian's. You think you're untouchable? He hissed. We'll bury you. Julian didn't back down. Try it. he said, his voice calm but steel-edged. Blake stormed out, but Julian knew the war wasn't over. That night, Matteo planned a rare evening out, dragging Julian to a dive bar on the edge of town. They danced to a jukebox's scratchy tunes, Matteo's laughter cutting through Julian's stress. For a moment, it was just them, swaying under dim lights, the world fading away. But as they left, a truck roared past, its driver shouting a slur. Matteo pulled Julian close, his arm protective. "We're okay," he said, but his voice shook. The next day, Sarah called with a lead. A private investigator, hired by Blake, was digging into Julian's past. "They're looking for dirt," she warned. "Anything to discredit you." Julian's stomach dropped. His past wasn't perfect. Petty trouble as a teen, a few bad debts, but nothing illegal. Still, in Havenwood, truth didn't matter as much as perception. Julian and Matteo strategized over dinner, their small kitchen filled with the scent of Matteo's pozole. "We fight back with the truth," Matteo said. "Show this town who you are." Julian nodded, inspired by Matteo's fire. They planned a community event, a showcase for the Foundation's new programs, inviting everyone, supporters and skeptics alike. The event was held at the town square, with booths for art, music, and Riley's support group. Julian spoke to the crowd, his voice raw but resolute. "This foundation is for all of us," he said, "not just the ones who fit in." Some cheered, others walked away, but Riley hugged him afterward, tears in their eyes. "You're making it better," they said. As the event ended, Julian noticed a man watching from the crowd. Tall, gray-haired, familiar. It was Thomas from Roland's letters, now in his 70s. Their eyes met, and Thomas nodded, a silent acknowledgement. Julian's heart ached for the life Roland never lived. The community event marked a turning point, but Havenwood's wounds ran deep. Julian and Matteo braced for the final months of their year, knowing the Whitakers wouldn't relent. Blake's investigator unearthed a decade-old shoplifting charge from Julian's teens, spinning it into a smear campaign. Flyers appeared around town, calling Julian a criminal unfit to lead. The local paper ran with it, and whispers grew louder. Julian felt the town slipping away, but Matteo refused to let him spiral. "They're scared because you're winning," he said, taping up a broken window from another prank. Together, they planned a final push, a gala to celebrate the Foundation's new direction, with grants for queer youth, affordable housing, and mental health. Julian invited Thomas, hoping his presence would honor Roland's hidden truth. The gala was held at the Whitaker estate, its halls transformed with lights and music. Riley's support group performed a spoken-word piece, their voices raw and powerful. Sarah emceed, her humor disarming the crowd. Even some skeptics attended, curious about Julian's vision. Matteo, dashing in a tailored suit, stayed by Julian's side, his warmth a shield against the Whitakers' glares. Thomas arrived, his face weathered but kind. Over wine he shared stories of Roland, his brilliance, his fear, his regret. "He admired you," Thomas said. "You lived the life he couldn't." Julian's throat tightened. For the first time he saw Roland not as a tyrant, but as a man trapped by his own choices. As Julian took the stage to announce the new grants, Blake interrupted, storming in with a lawyer. "This is a sham," he shouted, waving papers. "Julian's unfit, and we'll prove it in court." The crowd murmured, tension spiking. Julian's heart raced, but Matteo's hand on his shoulder steadied him. "I'm not perfect," Julian said, his voice carrying over the chaos. But I'm here for this town, for its people, all of them. If you don't believe me, look at what we've built. He gestured to Riley, to Sarah, to the families helped by the foundation. The room quieted, some nodding, others uncertain. Blake stormed out, but the tide was turning. The year ended with the Whitakers' lawsuits failing. Hargrove's meticulous records proved the will's legitimacy. Julian and Mateo stayed in Havenwood, not just for the inheritance, but for the community they'd built. The foundation thrived, funding centers across the state, including Mateo's dream, a queer youth hub in San Francisco. On their last night in the cottage, Julian and Mateo stood on the cliffside where they'd first decided to stay. The ocean roared below, the sunset painting the sky gold. "We did it," Mateo said, his hand in Julian's. "No," Julian said, smiling. "We're just starting." The will had given Julian power, but love, his for Mateo, theirs for the community, had given him purpose. Havenwood wasn't perfect, but it was changing, and so was he.